Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida. We're joined today by Mary Nell Armstrong with Tall Timbers Research Station. Today we'll have a presentation by Dr. Megan Johnson from the U.S. Forest Service. Dr. Johnson will be giving a presentation discussing her work on climate change and prescribed fire in the southeastern U.S. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Megan Johnson recently received her Ph.D. from NC State University in Raleigh, working with Dr. Fernando Garcia Menendez. Her research focused on smoke impacts from southeastern wildland fire and examined questions at the interface of land management and air quality management. Megan is currently an ORISE postdoctoral fellow at the U.S. Forest Service, working within the Sustainable Forest Management Research area. While a PhD student, Megan was a Science to Action Fellow with the U.S. Geological Survey National Science Climate Adaptation Science Center and a recipient of a Joint Fire Science Program Graduate Research Innovation Award, a GRIN Award, if you've heard of those. She earned her BS in Environmental Engineering from CU Boulder and her MS in Atmospheric Science from the University of Nevada, Reno. So with all that, welcome everybody. I'm glad you're here. And Megan, we're glad to have you with us today. And 1 second as we just trade out presentations, everybody.
Thanks for that introduction, David. And thanks everyone for being here. It's really exciting to be on this side of Southern Fire Exchange webinar. Watched a lot of them as a student. As David said, I'm Megan Johnson. I'm currently a postdoc, an ORISE postdoc working with the Forest Service. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is a project from when I was a PhD student at NC State University in Raleigh, working with my advisor, Fernando Garcia Menendez. And this kind of main thing that we're talking about here, this survey of burners' concerns, needs, and possible alternatives with respect to climate change, was part of a project I did for the Science to Action Fellowship, which David mentioned. This was part of something that the National Climate Adaptation Science Center offers. And this fellowship encourages grad students to propose projects that obviously support their research, but have a clear focus on management or policy applications of their work, and especially related to climate change. And again, as David mentioned, my research as a PhD student at NC State was focused on smoke from wildland fire in the Southeast. And so not only did that entail estimating smoke impacts and how those might translate into health impacts for people who might be experiencing that smoke, but we really wanted to focus on what that meant for managers as well in terms of uncertainties in estimating smoke from burns that they're planning. Are these tools available to them, giving them reliable results, and thinking about their needs in being able to continue to use fire in the way they need to meet their important management goals. So really, like I said, a lot of my research focused on smoke, and we cared about that because it is a major contributor to air pollution in the US, especially this fine particulate pollution, or PM 2.5. And we care about that because it impacts human health in a lot of ways, thinking about asthma, COPD, or even premature death. And we know in the Southeast that wildland fire is largely prescribed fire. We know that this is something that's used more extensively in this region than most other parts of the country or the continent. And it's really important to meet various management objectives like habitat management and fuel reduction for other hazards. And this gets complicated in the Southeast, as a lot of you know, because we have a lot of folks living in the WUI, in the wild and urban interface. It's hard to use fire when you're that close. And this is also complicated by the fact that a lot of folks who live in the Southeast may be more vulnerable to health impacts from smoke due to their socioeconomic status. So that's something we really want to keep in mind when we're thinking about who is downwind of these fire projects. And on top of all this, we've got climate change. We know this is going to affect wildland fire across the globe, but in the Southeast, this is potentially problematic because it could reduce the available days for burning, as we define kind of the acceptable meteorological conditions as they are now. And coming from the smoke side of this and thinking about how does this impact smoke in the future, both from the wildfire side and the prescribed fire side in the Southeast. And so really what I'm talking about today is focused on this last piece, looking at how climate change could affect smoke in the region and what that really means for managers and all of that. So a lot of this was spurred on by this particular publication that came out partway through my PhD. A lot of you may be familiar with it. They projected good burning days in the future under a couple of different climate scenarios in the Southeast based on really important meteorological conditions, mining through burn permits to see kind of our thresholds and the important metrics that we need to use when we're thinking about the meteorological conditions that are important for prescribed fire in the region. And when I was reading this paper, I had several questions. The first of which, obviously, coming from the smoke side of things, how might this reduction in good burning days affect smoke? So there's a lot of ways this could potentially go. And really that comes down to how are the burners going to respond to a reduced number of days to burn in the future? What are they going to do? What options do they have, and what do they think is most reasonable for them? And kind of related to that is, are they actually concerned about this affecting their practices? Because there are a lot of different types of burners in the Southeast. And when we think about the future and how this might affect what they're doing, what might they need to continue to meet their management objectives? So my objectives in looking at this from a project perspective was, one, to evaluate and describe land manager concerns with respect to possible alterations or reductions in prescribed fire opportunities, and thinking about what they might do as an alternative and how they might meet their management objectives. Secondly, we also really wanted to get an idea of what managers' resource and information needs might be, particularly with respect to the future of prescribed fire use and maybe even smoke. And then third, because I come from the smoke modeling side of things, I did want to use this as an opportunity to quantify and compare contributions from wildfire and prescribed fire to air pollution in the Southeast, with a particular focus on what this could look like in the future under changes in activity because of climate change. So I'm going to start with the survey side of this, the first two objectives, and then we'll move into the third objective to kind of talk about how we use the survey to get an idea of what smoke could look like, a couple of scenarios of smoke impacts in the future based on activity changes. So first, the survey, which several of you may have taken because this was shared by the Southern Fire Exchange last year. I actually looked at the screenshot. This was from this date last year. We shared this electronically through the Southern Fire Exchange, through the Forestry Extension and NC State. I contacted a lot of state prescribed fire councils, a lot of local burn associations, and it got shared over and over from other people, which was fantastic. So if you took this survey or you shared the survey, thank you. I really, really appreciate it. And the point was really to target anybody who uses prescribed fire in the Southeast, because we know there are a lot of different folks who do use fire for different reasons and at different amounts. And we got a relatively good response, especially because this wasn't something I was super focused on as part of my dissertation. You know, this was kind of supplementary and supportive. But we got, just after having this open for about a month, we got, you know, over 200 usable responses, which was great. And here I'm just kind of showing you the distribution by zip code of who took the survey. And we got a great response from Florida and North Carolina, even a little bit in South Carolina and Louisiana. But it is notable here that we have kind of a hole in the middle. We didn't get great response from kind of the major burning states, aside from Florida. We didn't get a great response from Georgia or Alabama or even Mississippi. And so keeping that in mind, you know, there could be potentially more information that we want to have from those states in terms of what they might need, but hopefully their needs aren't too different than what everybody else in the region was able to talk to us about. So to tell you a little bit about yourselves, which feels a little bit weird, the burners who took this survey, at least half of them are burning on private land, if not also on state or federal land. But we know, you know, a lot of people who are burning in this region are burning on private land. And that's a big factor in thinking about how this might be different than a lot of other prescribed burning applications in the country. We wanted to get a handle on how often you're using fire in an average year. And it was kind of an interesting split. We have a large portion of folks who are burning more frequently, more than 10 burns a year. And then a large group who are also burning a lot less frequently, less than 5 burns a year. And we even had a couple folks say, you know, I don't even burn on average once a year. It's every couple of years. So it's a good spread and good thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about who we're talking to and what they might need. And again, this is just kind of a check for us to make sure we understand the real reasons for using fire in the region. And this is not necessarily surprising. Most folks are using this for habitat management and then fuel reduction and thinking about, restoration and control options as well. So not surprising there. But when we kind of started asking a little bit more of the questions about climate change, what does this mean to you? Are you concerned? Here we asked folks to indicate their level of agreement with the statement, I am able to use, oh, this isn't climate change yet, I'm sorry. I'm able to use prescribed fire as often as I would like. This is also not surprising. We know folks that generally would like to be able to use it a little bit more frequently, but overall we're seeing people in the majority agree to some level that they're able to use it as often as they would like, but a pretty large portion also wish they could use it more. And this is also not a surprise to us. When we asked folks to rank their top 3 reasons why they are not able to burn as often as they would like, number 1 is smoke management concerns. And number 2 and number 3, interestingly, are kind of opposites: excessive precipitation and drought conditions. So there's a lot of factors at play here that are also pretty extreme. And we need to keep all of that in mind as we think about how to help burners use fire for their management objectives, especially moving forward with climate change. Again, so now here we get to the climate piece. Sorry about that. When we ask if folks are concerned about using climate change or about climate change affecting their burning practices and their objectives in the future, this was an interestingly almost even split among the categories we provided there. The largest group said that they are, probably concerned that this is going to affect their practices, but the second largest group was just unsure. They need to know a little bit more about what this could mean for them, which is an opportunity for discussion and communication. And of the folks who said basically anything other than, no, I'm definitely not concerned about climate change, we asked, when do you think climate change could affect your burning practices? And again, most people are unsure. And this is a great opportunity for folks from the climate side to really get in and talk more about what this could mean. Obviously, timing is uncertain. That's a big part of the uncertainty there, but to be able to talk about options and thinking about the future there, this is a great opportunity for communication. And, close second to that, though, is people think that they're currently affected. So they're thinking about this a lot. This is on their mind, at least when it comes to what is impacting what you're able to do. So this was kind of one of the major questions we wanted to ask. If you were faced with fewer good burning days in the future, how would this change your burning operations? And overwhelmingly, folks want to try to consolidate their burning. They want to try and use the days that are available and burn more acres on those days if possible. But we see here secondarily that people also are recognizing that you're not going to be able to burn as often. And either that comes in the form of using a different practice. In that case, most folks said that they would either use, mechanical thinning or mastication or even herbicides as a replacement. But they also recognize that maybe they just wouldn't be able to burn instead of maybe supplementing. And we'll come back to that question when I get to the kind of smoke implications part of things. But we also really wanted to know what folks need and want when it comes to meeting burning objectives in a changing climate. And kind of, I've listed the top 4 here because they were all pretty close and not, again, surprising. We need more personnel. We need more folks to help us do this work. We need more equipment to be able to do this work. And when it comes to climate change, people are wanting to know more. They want information about what this means for them, which is great that they want to know. And we need to be able to get that to them. And then, I listed this 4th one because this is always important: funding. This is not going to change. People need more money to be able to do the things that they need to do. So, those are the top 4 important things, but there were also really some interesting responses to this question outside of the top 4 most important. There were a lot of write-ins related to air quality and smoke, and that's not surprising based on what we know about what seems like a major barrier to getting fire on the ground. And there were several write-ins related to the acceptance of burning and smoke, especially from the public, but also from the government. So we're seeing some frustration with some of the regulations surrounding what folks can do to get fire in the ground. Several mentions of liability insurance. We need better options for that. Heard that. Want to make sure that that gets shared, that we heard that. And then I thought this was also really important to note because of who we know the burners are in the region. You know, there are folks that only burn a couple days of the year, so they're not necessarily that worried about climate change impacting what they do, because if they only burn a couple days a year, reduced opportunities may not really have that big of an impact. And then the secondary one I thought was really important to bring up too: a changing climate does not change the resources I need. We know that folks need more people, more equipment, and more money to be able to do what they want to do with fire and meet these management objectives already. So this isn't necessarily new needs because of climate change, but this is going to be very important, especially as we think about how we can continue to use fire under a changing climate. And for those folks who said they want more information, we asked, what do you want to know? How can we help you out with that? And most people would love to know more about timing and location of impacts. And I think we all would. So there's a lot of uncertainty there, but obviously talking more about that, I think, is going to be very important and something that we need to focus on. And then obviously thinking about how they can adapt what they need to do to meet their objectives. Folks want to know what their options are. And while, you know, we have an idea of what you can use as an alternative, I think it's important for people to have an idea of what's out there and get a better handle on what they know. And I thought this was really great, and wanted to make sure we mention it here, that folks are interested in potentially getting in contact with regional climate scientists who understand their management objectives. And so that's fantastic. That's what we hope to do. And especially from, you know, this project being part of the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, that's kind of the main hope, is to be able to do this climate science that's bridging a gap with managers and researchers. So glad to hear that you actually want to hear from us too. And I also wanted to mention this, that, you know, we asked how you might want this information, and this was almost a completely even split in kind of the options provided. People want webinars, people want fact sheets, people want videos they can watch on their own time, and they would also like to be talked to in person, like have an in-person training type of an option. So keeping options open in terms of how we keep delivering this information is going to be very important. So to kind of summarize what we learned high level from this survey, we know that most burners in the Southeast are concerned at some level about climate change impacting their burning practices. And the majority of them are unsure about timing and would like to know more about that. And that's great. They'd also like to know about maybe some other adaptation options if there's something they don't already know about. And we know that in terms of how they're going to maybe respond to a reduction in burning days in the future, they'd like to try and consolidate their burn more acreage on the available days, but they recognize that that might not be feasible in some ways. And so they might have to either just burn less or adopt these other methods. But again, to do their jobs now and continuing to do so in the future under a changing climate, we need more personnel, we need more access to equipment, and again, this information and support. And I wanted to reiterate that we know we're missing some input from some high burning parts of the Southeast. And we hope that what we have heard from the region doesn't necessarily change a lot of these perspectives, but we just want to make sure that we're recognizing we're missing making that connection with some of those folks in the way that we shared this survey. So thinking about other options in terms of reaching out is going to be really important. So transitioning a little bit from this survey into implications for smoke in the region under a changing climate. What we did here was look at, again, resource needs, climate concerns, and what folks might do if they can't use fire as frequently. And so on the smoke side of this, we are thinking about how climate is going to impact fire activity. And so we have studies that have projected changes in, like I said, good days for prescribed fire in the Southeast. We also have studies that have projected wildfire burned area changes. And in this case, we used one that's specific to the Southeast. But in addition to these climate projections, what we did was we used this survey, this response to that question about how would you respond to a reduction in good burning days, and used that in conjunction with those projected climate changes to modify a recent record of prescribed fire emissions in the Southeast and run that through a 3D chemical transport air quality model to get some idea of future scenarios of smoke in the region, just based on activity changes, essentially. So I'll run you through a little bit of how we did that, and that'll also look at kind of what smoke looks like in a typical year in the Southeast and how that changes in the future. And then we'll wrap things up. So this might be, I'm trying not to get too in the weeds on what this means. And if you have questions about it later, obviously we can always talk about it. But to do the air quality modeling, we use this model from the EPA called CMAQ, or the Community Multi-Scale Air Quality Model. And we modeled pollution across the entire country, but our focus was definitely on the Southeast. And so we used this emissions data set from the EPA that is built up from their national emissions inventory. And what's cool about that with respect to fire is that they're actually getting this fire information as much as they can from states to get a better representation of what they know has happened in their own boundary in terms of fire, both prescribed fire and wildfire. But it also supplements with information from satellites, as well as other organizations that are keeping track of fire across the country. So this is really one of the best ways for us to get a handle on fire that's occurring in our country. And to isolate smoke impacts on air quality using this model, we basically run it 3 times. So we run it with emissions from all different sources, which includes fire, electric generating units, cars, things like that. And then we run it again by removing the fire emissions. And basically by taking the difference between those two, we understand what the contribution was from the fire sources themselves. And so when we think about this in the climate perspective, like I said, what we did is we're modifying those emissions. We're not modifying anything else here. We're thinking about how the activity modifies the resulting emissions. So we took that data set in combination with the climate projections and that survey response to get an idea of possible smoke scenarios in the future. So I'm going to run through a little bit about all of that. So here is where I'm giving you kind of a picture of what smoke looks like in the Southeast in a given typical year. So this is, like I said, this is based on 2018 records, but this is pretty typical for at least prescribed fire and a little below average for wildfire. But this is PM 2.5 altogether. So this is from all sources of air pollution in the Southeast. You can see cities are kind of popping out as bright red. That's where there's more pollution in general. We see a little bit cleaner up in the Appalachians. And when we break this down into PM 2.5 that's coming just from wildland fire, so both wildfire and prescribed fire, we see an interesting pattern emerge. We see a little bit of a bullseye over kind of our Alabama, Florida, Georgia region in the Southeast there. When we further break that down into prescribed fire and wildfire, we see that the prescribed fire pattern is very close to the overall wildland fire pattern. This isn't surprising. We know that the emissions break down this way, but to see it really truly there is an interesting visual. And we also know that this wildfire contribution is highly dependent on the year of record that we're using. And like I said, this 2018 year was maybe a little below average for wildfire in the region. But we can still see how there are major pockets of smoke contributions from some fires across the region in that year. So just to kind of, again, reiterate this from a total air quality perspective, this is looking at the percent contribution of these fires to total air pollution. And we see that wildland fire across the region broadly is largely contributing between 10 to 15% of the PM 2.5 pollution. But we see that escalates pretty quickly in that bullseye region up to 20, 25, close to 30% in that really tight bullseye region. And again, just that breakdown of how that's contributed between prescribed fire and wildfire in the region. So, like I said, knowing what we know about smoke in kind of a typical year, we use these climate projections with that survey response to kind of modify those emissions to think about how this activity is affecting smoke potentially in the future. And so We are using two different sets of projections, so these aren't directly comparable when we think about wildfire and prescribed fire, but gives us at least an idea of what things could look like based on activity changes. And we've used this particular study looking at changes in wildfire area burned in the Southeast because it is specific to the Southeast. And it also incorporates some really interesting social factors here. So obviously we've got our major kind of meteorological, climatological factors, but it's also taking into account changes in land use, changes in population, and changes in personal income, how those might affect burned area across the region. And so just kind of on average, looking at mid-century, we see by county how what the percent change in burned area could look like across the region. Red indicating an increase in burned area, blue indicating a decrease. So we have some interesting patterns and interesting mix up in the Appalachians, could be a little bit wild up in there. But so really the take home here was that we were able to use this study pretty directly with modifying the emissions, because emissions in the modeling framework that the EPA uses for their emissions for fire, these scale directly with the burned area. So we were able to take these changes in burned area and scale our emissions directly just to look at what that might mean in the future. And here I'm just showing you kind of the distribution of where those fires occurred in the year that we modeled specifically, and they're just colored by that change in emission scaling and burned area. And from the prescribed fire side, this is that paper I kind of mentioned at the beginning, the Cup for It All study, where they look at the change in burning days. So this isn't burned area. We have to figure out a way to use this change in burning days as a proxy for what future fire activity may look like on the prescribed fire side. And so like I said, what they're using is based on meteorology, and to kind of bring in that social side, what we did was we used that question. But first, to give you kind of a look at what this looked like, similar to the Prestamon picture, we have this broken down by season, because obviously that's important for prescribed fire. And when we look at mid-century across the region and across the year, we see that there could be a little bit of an opportunity for increase in burning in January, February, and even a little bit at the end of the year, October, November, December in the north. But overall, we see that reduction in possible burn opportunities. However, the biggest reduction in those burn opportunities is in the summer months. And we already know that not as much burning actually occurs in the summer months in the Southeast. We know that that happens in different months. So how much this really affects actual burning activity still kind of remains to be seen. And so, like I said, to really translate that change in burning days into something where we can use that to scale our emissions, we brought in the answer to this question. If you're faced with fewer burning days in the future, how would this change your operation? And from these answers, we saw kind of two possible scenarios that really could give us a bookend on what could occur, kind of a high and low scenario. So first, we see that maybe this just results in people reducing their burning overall. If they kind of let the change in burning days dictate how they burn completely, in terms of letting that reduce their burning or completely supplementing with something else that still results in a reduction in burning. So our first scenario is thinking about how that might scale just directly with the change in burning days. In our second scenario, we wanted to try and represent the folks who want to consolidate their burning. And we did this in kind of the full throttle version of that, where we conserve the total annual area burned. And what that ends up having to do is we have to shift burning from the months where there are reductions in good days to months where there aren't as serious of reductions. And this allows us to not necessarily change where burning actually happens, because we're using this record. So we're not changing any locations of burns. We're not changing burns to days where there weren't burns previously. We're just redistributing among what was actually there. So to look at this, how this change occurs across the region at mid-century, kind of on an annual average scale, I'm showing you here the percent change in fire PM2.5 from each of these three scenarios. Wildfire, our first prescribed fire scenario, which is that reduction just based on the change in burning days, and second prescribed fire, where we try to conserve that burning area. And so what you see here is that our wildfire scenario, while not directly comparable necessarily, because these aren't the same projections, we see that based on those projections, wildfire PM 2.5 could increase across the majority of the region by 10–15%. And in those areas where the fires were actually occurring, that's well over 20%, up into 50s and higher percentage increase in PM 2.5. Whereas when we look at this kind of on average between our two bookend scenarios of prescribed fire activity, we see that if burning decreases kind of following that trend, those climate projection trends, we see that there could be a slight decrease in PM 2.5 in some of the highest burning regions, but there's a large area where there would really be no change, and even a possibility of increased smoke in the north and the west part of the region, just based on that maybe possible increase at the beginning of the year. And in our secondary scenario, where we are keeping the burning amount the same, but shifting it to different times, we see that largely across the region, we might even have a little bit of an increase in smoke from prescribed fire, which is interesting. And so, like I said, this is an annual look average, how this might be. But we broke this down by month for each of these scenarios as well, just to show how this really varied between them. And so for the wildfire, which is on the top, this is much more variable. And like I said, definitely depends on the wildfire record we used, but you can see how large those increases can be in that sub-annual time scale. It's important to keep that in mind. And then we can see the real differences from the month to month between those two prescribed fire scenarios too. If we're just following with the reduction in burning days, our increase in the beginning of the year isn't as strong, but there is a slight one. We still see that a little bit of a decrease in the shoulder months and the largest decrease in the summer. But when we look at that prescribed fire scenario, there's increases basically outside of the summer, no matter what, because we're shifting that burning. And those increases are largest in December and November. Those in some places were up to 50% increase in PM 2.5 from prescribed fire across the region. So bringing this back to kind of a total air quality implications perspective, you may or may not know that the EPA is in the process of revisiting their annual PM 2.5 standard, the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, or NAQ. And right now, the Southeast is in compliance. There's nobody out of compliance with this standard, which is 12 micrograms per cubic meter. But what I'm showing you here with these first two panels is to show that, like, if we're looking at what the possible range of considered future standards are and current burning activity, we see that this activity could put some areas in the region at risk of exceeding a strengthened PM 2.5 standard. And really what I'm showing you on these maps, any pixel that's highlighted is covering that range of possible considered standards. So that could vary widely depending on what that future standard actually is. But it's important for us to consider just this current burning activity. But when we think about even future burning activity, this could also affect some compliance with a range of those possible scenarios. It might be a little harder to see when this is on a smaller screen. I'm sorry about that. But in these future scenarios, we tried to highlight the pixels in red where there would be an additional exceedance based on that kind of fire activity. And so there's more exceedances in RX2 and then more exceedances in the modified wildfire scenario. It's actually interesting in the modified prescribed fire scenario. We actually have a few areas that could avoid an additional exceedance because of the reduced burning potential based on just the change in days. So to wrap up a little bit what we talked about in the modeling, I know that got a little off track into some of the smoke side of things, but we'll bring it all back together. So really from this kind of exercise, we see that depending on how managers respond, we could see some different changes here in terms of smoke in the region. If we reduce or replace prescribed fire, we might see a slight decrease in smoke in some of the heaviest burning areas, but even then we might still have some places that have a little bit of an increase. Or if we're trying to really compress our burning into the available days, this could potentially lead to a small increase in some smoke across the region. But it's important to note here too, that while we know on average prescribed fire has a larger impact on PM 2.5 in the region, at least in our modeling scenarios, we see that the increase in wildfire PM 2.5, both relatively and absolutely in terms of actual concentration, was larger in any of the scenarios modeled. So thinking about the future of wildfire is going to be very important when it comes to smoke, not just prescribed fire. And like I said, you know, these altered fire activities could affect compliance with future strengthened air quality standards. So it's important to keep that in mind as we think about how to move forward with fire in the region. So trying to bring all these pieces back together for what this means for prescribed fire in the Southeast, which is a big task, and I'm definitely not addressing everything, but just from this perspective, we know that climate-driven changes to meteorology are probably going to constrain how we can use prescribed fire in the Southeast, and are also going to potentially hinder expansions of burning in other regions. This is pretty well known. We also know that the way we consider acceptable burning conditions is up to us. And so we could change what we decide is an acceptable burning condition. Even just like flexing it slightly could yield several more burning days if we relax kind of our limit on wind speed, something like that. But while we can do that, we need to think about why and should we. We need to be really carefully analyzing what those changes in activity could mean for people downwind. And especially, like I said, in the Southeast, we have a vulnerable population. We got to keep them in mind. I'm sorry. Excuse me. And like I said, you know, this really all comes back to what we're going to deem acceptable in terms of the conditions and the trade-offs that we are willing to make. It's always been a game of trade-offs, and it's not going to change in the future. We know this. As we've seen from the survey piece of this, many burners in the Southeast are concerned about climate change impacting their practices, but their resource needs are largely similar to what they might need normally, regardless of the climate. But, you know, that type of support might be the same, but, you know, we may need more of this support, especially as we think about how to meet these objectives in the future. If we're using something that's more labor intensive or more personnel intensive, we need to have maybe more support in those areas than we're already needing right now to meet this current level of demand for prescribed fire. And so, yeah, like this modeling scenario didn't even think about potential expanded use of prescribed fire in the future. This was just looking at current burning levels. And so it's really going to be important as we move forward to improve and expand our interagency coordination to reconcile this desire for a need for prescribed fire use and expansion with fewer acceptable burning opportunities. And we do need to think about that from a smoke perspective, because we don't want to overburden anyone in that way. So that was a lot, and I'm glad that you stuck with me and showed up, and I really appreciate it. And I also really appreciate you if you took the survey or shared it. Like I said, it's fantastic to get that level of response from this community. And I definitely didn't do this work in a vacuum. So thanks to everybody who's helped me do this stuff. And I'm excited to hear what questions you might have for me.
Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson, for your presentation. It's great. We enjoyed it. And again, this is a presentation by Dr. Megan Johnson, who's now an ORISE postdoctoral researcher with the U.S. Forest Service. She was talking about her work when she was working on her Ph.D. at NC State University. My name is David Godwin. I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange. And at this point in our program, we would invite everyone who has questions to please put their questions into the Q&A tool in Zoom. And as you do so, you should be able to see questions from other folks in the audience today. So if you see other questions that you really like, and you would like us to try and get to them in the time that we have remaining, please click on the little thumbs up button. And that thumbs up button will let us to prioritize the questions that are coming in, so we can get to the ones that are most interesting to everybody. So with that, Megan, I'm going to hop over here and see what kind of questions we have coming in. Appreciate your work. it's certainly interesting, and I see some interesting things that have come in already. One that I see came in from Ximing, and they said, did the projected fire PM 2.5 simulations for the wildfire RX1 and RX2 use 2018 meteorology?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, the answer is yes. And the reason we did this is because we were working from the burning record that we had in 2018. And because prescribed fire is so dependent on those conditions, we didn't want to complicate this process by trying to find projected meteorology and thinking about when we're allocating those burns based on the meteorology as well. So we used the same meteorology, but changed the activity based on what we understood the climate projection changes to be to the meteorology, if that makes sense.
All right, hopefully it does. And if they have questions, they can put a follow-up question in the Q&A tool. Interesting question from Samantha. Samantha says, do you consider smoke PM 2.5 contributions from wildfires outside of the Southeastern domain? That's really relevant to what a lot of us have experienced this summer.
For sure, yeah. Smoke transport is a big part of anything regarding wildfire. And short answer is yes, but so really, like I said, the modeling itself did cover the entire US. And so kind of our baseline does account for whatever smoke may have been transported from other regions. But when we thought about climate, the only modifications we made were to fires actually occurring in the Southeast. So we weren't modifying any of fire activity outside. So what we were really trying to isolate what changes might have been occurring in the Southeast alone, rather than thinking about changes from outside. So that is a valid, important question, but that's how we kind of isolated things.
Here's a good question from Miguel. Miguel says, less burning days in the summer would harm prescribed burning for those of us who want to emulate natural fire cycles and burn during growing seasons instead of dormant seasons. Correct, he says. Would have to shift to alternatives if we don't want to increase our dormant season burning. So he's thinking about how window shifting may conflict with prescribed burning for ecological or restoration purposes, when they're starting to think more specifically about burn regimes and burn windows, not just like on the calendar, but how that impacts ecologically.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's a great point. And that is something, we weren't able to get down to that granular level to understand why people were burning in the times that they were, right? So we do, we tried to get kind of a bookend on a larger picture for the region, but that is a very important consideration, like thinking about your own objectives in what you're trying to do. These burning day shifts could actually be a big impact for you.
Here's a question from Gil, and I'm going to try and work my way through this one here. I hope you can see it as well. Yeah. So Gil says, so we had the same wildfire projection for RX1 and RX2 cases. Is there an included a relationship of more prescribed fire and less wildfire, as prescribed fire is supposed to reduce wildfire frequency? So that seems to be like question one, and that is a relevant question. A lot of the arguments for prescribed fire, right, are that more prescribed fire means less wildfire. So is that something that's kind of factored into these models of emissions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in separating the scenarios the way we did, those were really trying to just show the individual changes of those specific fire scenarios. So yes, both RX1 and RX2 had the same wildfire activity. In those cases, we didn't actually change the wildfire activity. That was just the baseline wildfire activity that had happened in there. But that is a very important question in terms of thinking of how this prescribed fire activity would affect wildfire activity. And while we didn't address that specifically in these scenarios, the wildfire scenario that we used, the projections there, like I said, we recognize they're not directly comparable because they are different climate projections and different models getting us to those changes. But the authors of that study tried to incorporate a lot of different variables that also likely explain some prescribed fire activity which impacts wildfire activity. So we don't have an explicit representation of that on our end, but we know that the wildfire scenario we modeled does have some version of that there. But like I said, it's hard for us to do any direct comparison between the prescribed fire scenarios we modeled and the wildfire scenario we modeled. I hope that helps answer that question.
I think so. We had a question or a comment in the Q&A tool asking if you could flip back to the slide.
Yeah, sorry, I was
here.
trying to and it wasn't going. So let's see here.
So you could
there we go.
Elaborate on that a bit.
Let's see, we'll go to the actual projection slide. So yeah, so this is where I was trying to get to, and I was explaining that to see if we could explain that a little bit better. Like I said, they kind of kept in the important variables in their statistical model and thinking about projections of burned area. And they said that the variables they're including do explain prescribed fire activity as well. It's not an explicit variable within their statistical model, but they expect that this is representing some level of prescribed fire activity that could be mitigating wildfire activity as well. But there's a lot of moving parts to that. And I think a lot of that also comes into play when we're looking at that population piece, because of where people are moving, that may affect how we are using prescribed fire in some of the WUI areas again. And also kind of the income that's going to have some dictation on where we're focusing some of those efforts. Does that help explain? I hope.
I think so. We'll look and see if we get more questions that tie in with that. Your work, I think, brings together some really interesting questions and things to think about in terms of thinking about these compressed windows that may be the future for prescribed burning in the Southeast. And, you know, if we have fewer opportunities for prescribed burning, regardless of what hat you wear, right? Whether you're with an agency or a private landowner or an NGO or a state, federal, whatever, if those windows are compressed, you know, what do you think that looks like for the future of prescribed burning? What are the needs that are going to arise to help be able to sustain the use of that tool?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that is kind of the big question we're all trying to figure out right now. And I think based on, you know, just on the little bit of work I've been able to do looking into this, some of the things that I see as really important, like I said, is we're really going to have to improve how we're coordinating our efforts around this, and we're going to have to improve our communication about a lot of this. Like I said, you know, with this, we're considering, you know, air quality. That's kind of the major area I came from originally and moved into kind of the fire world. But the human health side and the human safety side, especially thinking about the wildfire piece of this, we really have to coordinate this better in terms of what we deem important and acceptable. And so, you know, I think one of the hard parts with the air quality side is we know that it's really hard to say what is an acceptable level of pollution when it comes to human health. It's really hard to make that determination, and people have been working on that for a long time. But we also really want to be able to protect folks from fire itself and from huge amounts of smoke coming from wildfire. And so I think, like I said, we're going to have to do a much better job of being active in our communication and coordination of how we're going to work towards something like this in the future. And it's going to take a lot of thought about what is acceptable in terms of pollution and in terms of action, I guess, in terms of mitigation efforts and supporting those folks who are doing that.
Mm-hmm. I've been saying for years, the future is smoky. And so you know, whether it's going to be more wildfires or more prescribed fires, or probably a combination of both, I think there's evidence that we've kind of lived in a fire deficit in many areas,
Right.
for many reasons, and that the likelihood is that the future will be smoky. And so there are efforts out west, and I haven't seen much of it in the eastern or southeastern US, to foster what they call smoke ready communities. And those programs tend to be focused on helping communities to be prepared for wildfire smoke incidents. And maybe those are the kinds of things that we need to start working on developing here in the Southeast, because there are lots of programs, longleaf restoration, NRCS with cost share programs directed towards private landowners. Lots of our ecosystems, we're trying to put more prescribed fire on the ground. And your models are showing that we'll probably have more wildfires on the ground too. And we know most of our ignitions in the Southeast are human caused ignitions. So as population growth expands, increases, we'll have more people on the landscape, arguably drier landscape. So if we have more fires, maybe we need to think about how we can have smoke ready communities so that we're fostering resilient communities of people while we're working to try and foster resilient natural communities.
Yeah, definitely. I think, there's a lot of, like you said, a lot of work around that, especially out west. And I know there's a lot of national efforts about trying to understand how people are perceiving smoke and their risk there too, because we want to be able to improve that messaging in terms of what people are experiencing and what may be problematic. And so, there's a lot of effort in that area, and I think we're going to see a lot of that coming out soon, in especially when we get smoke events the way we have already this summer, even out east and out up north. I think this is very important to a lot of people, and once we all start kind of bringing the pieces together, this is going to be pretty helpful. But yeah, it's smoky, and we're going to have to figure out how to work around what we need to do to handle it.
Mm-hmm. One last question. We have a couple questions in here that I think we'll try and address some of those off the line, and we'll get your email address up on the screen in just a second for those who would like to follow up with you. Having worked with one of the climate adaptation science centers, what is something that you would like the prescribed fire communities of the Southeastern US, what would you like them to kind of the take home message or understand about where we are with understanding climate change in the Southeast?
That's a big question. And
it is a big question, but if you most people want a nugget, if you could think about what would you wish people understood?
I hope that you understand that it is a very complex problem that people are working really hard to understand. And as we learn more, what we may understand can change a little bit. And that doesn't mean that we don't know a lot of stuff. It just means that our understanding has changed. So as long as we can all be understanding in what uncertainty there may be, we're still working hard to figure out what the future could look like for people in all of their aspects of life, and especially thinking about how we can continue to manage the lands in the ways we deem necessary.
So Megan, thank you so much for joining us today. Enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks for having me. This was really fun.
Great. Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us. And we hope that this webinar will be useful in your fire management programs wherever you are. And have a great afternoon.